rhyme. This is a big problem and it needed to be addressed much earlier. So we want to keep our eyes open for that. Also, I want you to look in, see if you can tell me what is metalinguistics? What is meta? And so just remember, meta means conscious knowledge, conscious awareness. So what does metalinguistic knowledge have to do with literacy? Um, Phonological, being aware of things like um, that, for example, things like that, the sound, this sound sounds like an S, but but orthographically, it could be a C or an S. Okay. Morphological, knowing that I've got to, if I want to add ed to show past tense, I have to add ed. These are all examples. So I want you to generate your own examples in your annotations of each of these. All right, African American English. One topic that seemed to be a little confusing was the idea of dialect density. This is not how many people in the community speak the dialect. It has to do with an individual and how many features of the dialect the individual uses. A high number of the features in someone's spoken language or written language indicates a high level of dialect density. Is one dialect or a language correct? This was something that some people missed in the quiz. The answer is no. They are all rule-based. So this is not trying to be politically correct, everybody. Just be aware that, for example, if you spoke German, you are not speaking incorrect English. You are not speaking incorrect anything. You're speaking a rule-based language. And we can apply this to dialects because dialects are also rule-based. Mainstream classroom English is a dialect of English. It is no more correct than another. Now, you may say, well, I go into classrooms all the time and the teacher says this is correct English. Let's change that. Let's change talking about correct English because again, what that does is disparages different variants of English. This is the language that we've agreed upon to use in our classroom and in our writing for formal writing, for reading, and we do need to support mainstream classroom English. But how can we do this by supporting the student's home language or dialect as valid, equal, and also providing direct instruction? Again, if you had a student who arrived in your classroom whose home language was German, you would not say to them, oh, you said Hund instead of dog. That's incorrect English. You would say, oh, you used German to say dog. We're going to use classroom English to say dog. Let's treat dialects the same way. All right. Oh, that's really cool. You used African American English structure to say that. How would we say that in mainstream classroom English? So we're not disparaging but we're also providing support that will help the student to consume the educational materials, which, right or wrong, are typically written in mainstream classroom English and help to decrease that gap that we're seeing in achievement. Bilingual learners. So a couple of topics is what is the difference between acquisition, language acquisition, unconscious, which is what most of us are doing when we learn our primary language, versus learning, which is conscious. So if you took a foreign language in school and you had to literally have vocabulary words that you translated from your native language, that was language learning, not language acquisition. So the difference between those two is important. because your bilingual students who are English language learners are not necessarily acquiring English. They have to go through a conscious process to learn it. What is the difference between language proficiency versus dominance? I want you to put that in your annotations here and use your resources to understand that. And perhaps you know it without looking it up. That's even better. What's the difference between BICS, or basic interpersonal communication skills, versus CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency? CALP is much higher level. BICS is lower level. So we need our students who are bilingual learners to work into that level of proficiency that we call CALP in order to be successful with reading and writing and the language tasks related to learning other subjects. One of the strategies that's talked about in the reading, and we touched on, I believe, in class, was dialogue journals. And these are journals in which the teacher and the bilingual or the English language learning student go back and forth with each other and really kind of talking about what they're learning and the teacher commenting and responding to that. This is not a time that the teacher corrects the students' writing. This is more commenting on the content of what they're sharing and what they're learning. And this is one way we can support our English language learning students. Another thing that came up, how do we increase interaction between students? Because this is one way that we can increase the language models for our English language learning students. So what can we do? Put that in your annotation. You know, what can we do to increase their interactions? What can we do to get them to interact? Now, dialogue journals aren't going to be the way, because that's how we're interacting. That's one way we're enhancing our interaction. But if we want to increase the students' interactions with each other, what can we be doing? What kinds of assignments can we give? What kinds of opportunities can we give? All right, before we go, I did want to go over the last two quizzes with you. And so let me get to that screen and share it. So first we're going to talk about quiz 13. And this question was about dialogue journals. So this was just something that we just talked about in the review. So the dialogue journals, and the answer was the teacher focuses on the intent and meaning of the communication attempts. Okay, so we're not going, and this one suggests that it's between students. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad idea, but it's not what we're referring to with dialogue journals between the teacher and student. It isn't involving students responding to each other on the journal. This one, the student provides written monologue regarding their learning. So a monologue would be not a dialogue. It would just be the student journaling without the teacher responding. But dialogue journals has the teacher writing in the journal and saying things to what the student has written. And, the teacher evaluating the student's written form is not what's intended with the dialogue journals. This is not the place for that kind of correction. That kind of correction absolutely is appropriate, but it's not what we're doing in the dialogue journals. This question, which of the following is a way to increase interaction between students as a way to enhance English language learning? So this was a question that I had on that last slide. So assigning collaborative projects. So we did this semester where you had these application projects. You came with your own completed copy, and then you collaborated with your teammates on a final copy. So that is a way that we can really enhance, increase interaction between students, and that's a really important thing. This is just a good example here that I think the folks who chose some of these other options, maybe they didn't know dialogue journals were supposed to be between the student and the teacher, but pre-teaching vocabulary and activating schemas, which are great strategies, by the way, for English language learners, these aren't ways to increase interaction between students. This is more of a teacher-student interaction or teacher-classroom interaction. So this is a good reminder. Take a moment to make sure that you are reading the question stem very carefully. And that's something that sometimes students in their nervousness and their rush may not always read the question stem very carefully. And that can result in getting something wrong and thinking later, I knew the answer to that. All right, so learning a language implies a conscious process. Remember that that's in contrast to the topic of acquiring a language, which is not necessarily conscious. Babies are acquiring language, toddlers are acquiring, but they don't need conscious awareness to acquire it. This one is the degree of mastery of an individual's linguistic ability for listening, understanding, speaking, reading, writing a language is called proficiency. So now you could be proficient in 2 languages, but you may be dominant in one over the other. You may have dominance in your first language. Usually that is the case. You could be proficient in more than one language, but your language dominance is the one that you're using the most in your reading and writing and your spoken language. So that's how there's a difference between proficiency and dominance. You also could have that you don't have proficiency in any language, but one is still a dominant language. This one is language skills needed for social interaction on the playground and school bus, playing sports and talking on the telephone are referred to as basic interpersonal communication skills. So these are important skills, but they are not as high level as cognitive academic language proficiency or CALP. So children may have these BICS skills, but that will not be sufficient for them to be successful with classroom learning in mainstream classroom English. Match the stage of second language learning with the correct descriptor. Here's a good example of a matching. So knowing these stages, you all did very well with this. Stage 1 being the silent period, early production stage. I may have made this a little easy by having them in the same sequence, but you can see that final stage, cognitive academic language proficiency, that is the highest level of proficiency that we'll see. Again, people did well with this. A child who acquires 2 languages at the same time would be considered a simultaneous bilingual speaker. True, or simultaneous is the answer. Sequential would be, if you're learning one language and then acquiring a second language. A child who learns a second language, L2, after they are somewhat proficient in their L1 would be considered a sequential bilingual. So if you studied a language in high school or college and you've become proficient in that, but it wasn't your native language, you are a sequential bilingual speaker. Which of the following is an example of higher order thought questions about shared book reading that teachers can